What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. So a couple months ago and on my Instagram today, I've done grading every single coach in the NHL based on this season. And I thought it'd be a fun idea to do that for general managers, but you really can't just look at this season for a general manager. You have to look at the overall body of work. So today we are going to be doing the Western Conference general managers, grading their entire tenures. Some of these guys have been on the job for like a year. Some of the guys like Doug Armstrong have been there since 2010. There is a lot to talk about with these guys. There's so much. I have like 11 pages of notes just for this part of the video. Not even Eastern Conference. There's a lot to dive in when you're spanning across this long of a time horizon. So today we're going to be looking at the Western Conference. I'm going to be honest. I am not going to be giving extremely high grades to teams that have not sniffed, general managers that have not sniffed the playoffs. So if someone's deep in a rebuild, I'm going to be hesitant to give them that good of a grade because it's easy to trade your expiring unrestricted free agents and draft high and make it look good. But until you actually put out a competitive product on the ice, I can't really give you that fantastic move. We've seen plenty of times guys what appears to be have back-to-back drafts that appear good, then their guys bust, then they absolutely suck. So if some of the newer general managers that are rebuilding right now don't have the highest grades, that is why. But without further ado, up first is one of those guys, and that is Kyle Davidson. And I think he has done a fantastic job when it comes to rebuilding. I'm going to give him a B+, again, just because I can't give him an A- when the team still absolutely stinks. But when looking at what he inherited back in 2021, they were coming off that massive scandal. Obviously, they had to fire Bowman. He came in when the Blackhawks' reputation was at an all-time low, and he had to just overhaul the entire roster. And when looking at what happened the summer prior, they traded for Seth Jones. They traded 2 first-round picks, which turned into David Jiricek and Cole Sillinger for Seth Jones. They got another first. They got the 32nd overall pick in that trade, which turned out to be Owen Allen, who is not doing anything in the AHL right now. So they basically gave up Sillinger and Jiricek for Seth Jones, and then signed him to that 8-year, $9.5 million contract. So he inherited a horrible situation, but he has done a very good job getting a shit ton of assets, took on Tyler Johnson for a second-round pick, got 2 first-round picks for Brandon Hagel, which looks fantastic for them. It was also a good deal for Tampa because he's been so cheap. Got a second-round pick for Marc-Andre Fleury after taking him on for literally nothing. DeBrincat got the 7th overall pick for him as well as a second. Took Kevin Korchinski, who I'm very high on. I think that he's going to be their future offensive defenseman unless they take a stab in like the top 5 on another guy, as well as the fact they traded Kirby Dach, who I still think Kirby Dach's a very good player, but wasn't really lining up with their new timeline. So they got the 13th overall pick. They got Frank Nazar, who I think easily could end up being better than Kirby Dach. Got a second-round pick to take on Nikita Zaitsev from the Senators, a first and a second for Jake McCabe and Sam Lafferty, who had 1.5 years left, weren't part of their long-term deals. Got a first and a second for that. Kane return was okay. Got a second round for Domi. Perry obviously blew up in Kyle Davidson's face, but it was his fault maybe not doing the due diligence, but Corey Perry was a veteran, and as soon as he figured it out, obviously he immediately threw Corey Perry off the team. What happened after the incident was textbook good leadership by Kyle Davidson. So in looking at it, they now have a shit ton of picks, an elite prospect pool, and obviously getting Connor Bedard makes any general manager look good, but Kyle Davidson has done a very good job, and as a result, he gets a B+. Next up, Jim Nill of the Dallas Stars. I give him an A. He has kept Dallas highly competitive over the last decade since he's been there. They have been over 88 pace 10 out of those 11 seasons, and they have basically transitioned smoothly as hell from the Jamie Benn, Tyler Seguin era that he walked into to now, or he basically established, to now going into that Miro Heiskanen and Jason Robertson era, because he had that fantastic 2017 draft where he got Miro Heiskanen, Robertson, and Ottinger. So they went from Stanley Cup final in 2020. I think they missed the playoffs in the COVID-shortened season to back to being an elite high-end contender in the NHL and having a fantastic young core as well. Those 3 guys that I obviously mentioned, as well as 2020 getting Maverick Bourque 30th overall, I believe, as well as the following draft getting Wyatt Johnston and Logan Stankoven. They are set for the future because of Jim Nill has been a fantastic general manager, as well as a bunch of other very good trades and signings. Joe Pavelski comes to mind. Got him pretty cheap. He's been basically point per game outside of his first season. Jim Nill has been an elite general manager since he got the job, and especially the last 5 years have been fantastic, or 5 or 6 years. 2017 draft on, he's arguably been probably the best general manager that hasn't won a Stanley Cup. So I'm looking at Jim Nill, fantastic job in Dallas. Next up, Ron Francis. I'm going to go with the B-. I didn't love his expansion draft. They played it very bland. They didn't do a Vegas, get a bunch of assets. And I'm sure there wasn't as many deals compared to Vegas. Teams were just very scared with the Vegas expansion draft. But he basically did nothing in terms of accumulating assets. And while he did get some good pieces in that expansion draft, Vince Dunn, Joey Decord, Jared McCann, all panning out to be very good players, it overall is still a pretty average roster when you look at it on the whole. They obviously sucked their first year, then popped off the second year 100 points, but that was from an insanely juiced shooting percentage. They were by far the most luckiest team per expected goals, shooting above expected goals percentage. So in looking at it, yes, they do have a pretty bright future. Beniers, I still think, can be a stud, even though he's having a down year. Shane Wright was a solid pick at 4th overall, considering they were picking at 4th. And as a whole, their prospect pool is pretty strong. You look at it, Furcus, Rakoff, Caden Price, Edward Chalet, Yanni Neiman. They still have a good prospect pool, but I don't think that they're set up for this great run, considering the expansion draft, the way that it went. They didn't get nearly enough assets, and now they're just in this weird spot of being around the perfectly mid-80-point team. So unless 3 of those prospects that I mentioned, non-Shane Wright, because he's kind of expected to be a stud, they need at least 3 of those guys to turn into high NHL level players, or else I think they're going to be in this mediocrity phase. So I'm going to give Ron Francis a B-. Next up, Craig Conroy. Not a ton to go off of. I'm just going to go with a B+. He inherited kind of a weird situation. Flames came off such a bad year when he became the general manager. I'm going to go with a B+. You look at it, the Toffoli deal, although I still think the New Jersey Devils was better for them. Sharon Govich has been an important piece. Hopefully he ends up selling at this year's deadline, at least sells in Elias Lindholm and kind of looks more to the future. And when looking at it this year in the draft, Sam Honzik looks like he's progressing pretty well. Suniev, their third round pick at UMass, has been playing very good. And the Zadorov trade, although a 3rd round pick isn't much considering he openly wanted out, that was solid work. So Craig Conroy's been pretty solid. I'm going to give him a B-. Chris McFarland, I'm actually going to go with a B- on this. When looking at Chris McFarland, it hasn't been that good. He inherited after that Stanley Cup run, and I understand that first year they weren't going to go like all in again because they weren't sure about the health of Gabriel Landeskog, as well as the fact that they traded a shit ton of picks at that year's deadline to load up and go on that deep run. They ended up just trading for like Lars Eller, got obviously bounced in that first round. But this summer, they clearly needed to address that second line center after we saw Nazem Kadri, fantastic on that cup run. The following year, just not the same. They go out, they get Ryan Johansson, and even at $4 million, he has not really been worth that. I do like the Alex Newhook deal that they made for the 31st and 37th overall pick, and the fact that they flipped that 37th for Ross Colton. Ross Colton's been solid. He's been about a 45-point middle sixer that you expect. The Miles Wood contract, I still don't like. He is playing better than he did in his final years in New Jersey, but still 5 more years at $2.5 million. He did get a good deal on the Lehkonen extension at 4.5. Natrushkin, I have no clue what's going on with that. Devontae hasn't been that good, just signed the extension. Hopefully he bounces back. I think he will, but a little bit concerning considering they just gave him 7 years. But overall, McFarland, it's going to be a very important deadline for him because a year and a half in, the Avalanche have been relatively disappointing compared to their expectations, especially getting bounced in the first round. Didn't address that number 1 center position, or number 2 center position. Obviously, they got the number 1 center position figured out, but when looking at the number 2 center, that was the number 1 priority. Didn't really effectively do that, as well as the goaltending. Georgiev is not looking that good, so there's definite holes on this team that he did not patch up during the offseason, so I am a little bit low on him. Pat Verbeek, B+, similar to a Kyle Davidson, has been rebuilding his entire tenure since he got there, and I believe February of 2022. Immediately, as soon as he got the job, traded Manson for a 2nd-round pick, traded Lindholm for a 1st and 2nd, got very good returns on them. His first full draft with the team ended up taking Mintyukov at 10th overall. That looks like an absolute steal, already playing at a high level in the NHL before he separated his shoulder. Also got Tristan Lanoux in that draft at 32nd 37th overall. So he's been a very good drafter, as well as obviously Leo Carlson the last year. And when looking at his negotiation practices, Troy Terry, he waited out, got a pretty solid deal for the team in that, as well as Trevor Zegras kind of made the right decision to bridge him instead of giving him this massive contract. That looks like it's paying off, considering he's not really played that good this year and now is hurt, as well as the fact that the Gauthier deal obviously was very good for the Anaheim Ducks. They really pounced on an opportunity. He was a proactive GM and got that done for Jamie Drysdale when they were pretty set on defense, with a guy like Olin Zellweger coming up soon. Vetrano was a very good signing. Killorn was not really a good signing. That's probably by far the biggest negative right now for Verbeek's tenure. And when looking at it, Radko Gudas has been solid, definitely getting up there in age, but I still think he's solid. Next up, Patrick Alvine, A-. A- for Patrick Alvine. First major deal was trading Bo Horvat. Don't think that was that good of a deal when you look at it, but obviously they flipped that pick for a Filip Hronek, so it ended up being a win for them. He signed Andrei Kuzmenko, fantastic in his first year. The re-signing was not as good, has not been playing to that level, might end up getting traded. JT Miller's extension looks fantastic now. That's another reason why the Canucks have been so good, getting JT Miller at $8 million when he's playing like a $10, $11 million player. The Smith trade, getting that legit backup goalie, as well as Lekaramaki and Brustevich look like very good picks during the Alvine tenure. I don't love the Willander pick, but I still think he's going to progress pretty well. So when looking at Alvine, I can't give him an A+ because it still is pretty new. They haven't even officially made the playoffs one time under him. They're obviously going to make the playoffs this year, but I think in his 2-year tenure at this point, it has been very good. So as a result, I'm going to go with an A-. Ken Holland, C+. It's just so bipolar, and considering he's had 4 full seasons with Connor McDavid and only has 3 playoff round wins, that is simply unacceptable. And when looking at it, he had some really horrible and also some really good moves. The horrible ones, the Nurse contract, it's not as bad now. Nurse is playing better, but he's probably like a $6-7 million defenseman. They still have 7 more years, including this year at $9.25 million. That's a bad deal. And then just straight up, Jack Campbell's one of the worst free agency signings of recent memory. I don't like the Evander Kane extension that he gave him, 4 years at $5.125 million. That still has 2 more years after this left on, and he's just getting worse every single year at this point. Brought in Connor Brown this offseason, $3.225 million next season on the cap because of his bonuses. That deal is looking like a goddamn disaster. So in looking at Ken Holland, as well as the Duncan Keith trade, the Philip Broberg pick, that was their last high pick, his only high pick with the team in the summer of 2019. Those are all disasters. The Cassian deal, I forgot to mention, 4 years, 3.2, which he had to end up trading a second and a third just to get rid of. Those are just so bad that I got to give him a C+. But when looking at it, Hyman has been one of the better signings of the entire 2020s in general. He's been fantastic. He did re-sign RNH to an 8-year, $5.125 million contract. That has been fantastic. The Matthias Ekholm trade has been great. Basically traded Tyson Barrie, Reed Schaefer in a first. Barrie and Schaefer, who really cares about them? First round pick was like 25th or 26th overall. So that was a fantastic deal, as well as the fact he did go out and get Corey Perry. So I think a C+, he's done a below average job. It's not the worst. There's definitely positives, but the negatives probably outweigh the positives when it comes to Ken Holland. Barry Trotz, B+. I doubted his moves this offseason. I thought they should have gone more rebuild, retool, but he goes out and gets Ryan O'Reilly, 4 years, $4.5 million. He's been fantastic. He's been a legit number 1 center worth $8.5 million. Gustav Nyquist, 2 years, $3.8 million. He has 36 points in 46 games. Luke Schen's the only meh deal. He took over obviously after the draft, and I think the Predators did have a pretty good draft. You can kind of count that as Trotz because that was Poyle on his last legs, but overall, Barry Trotz, B+. Mike Grier, really tough situation for Mike Grier. I'm going to go with a B, similarly to a Kyle Davidson. Obviously, they've sucked for basically his entire tenure. He inherited a horrible situation. Davidson inherited the worst situation back in 2021. Mike Grier was 2022. They had so many bad contracts on the books with a lot of term on it. Like, you look at it, it's not like there was these attractive players, kind of like Davidson at least had like a Hagel, I don't even know. But Brandon Hagel. But looking at it, Mike Grier, he had really nothing to work with. Erik Karlsson had 4 years left at $11 million, had to trade him, got a first-round pick. I thought that was a good deal. Brett Burns had 3 years left at $8 million. Yeah, 3 years left at $8 million. They had to retain money on that, and they only got a third round pick. Timo Meier was the only real piece that they could have dealt, and they didn't get that good of a return, but still got a first as well as a couple solid prospects to go along with that. So I think that he's doing a pretty solid job doing this retool. I really like the Will Smith pick. I think even though he didn't draft William Eklund, that's a good piece. This year is going to be really important because they're going to have probably that top 3 pick, as well as Pittsburgh's first rounder might end up being a lottery pick. It is top 10 protected, but I don't think the Penguins are going to be that bad. So in looking at it, this is going to be the year that he's really going to have to hit it out of the park. But right now, I think considering how bad it was in San Jose, given their contract structure, he's done a pretty solid job. Bill Armstrong, A-, similarly to Davidson. I think he's done a perfect job of coming into a pretty horrible situation. You look at it, he got hired in the summer of 2020. That was when the Coyotes got their first round pick stripped in 2021, as well as a second in 2020 for working out goddamn guys during COVID. It was absolute bullshit. But he came into a really tough situation. That was after they traded for Taylor Hall, and then Taylor Hall walked for literally nothing, so they didn't even have a first round pick in 2020. So they ended up just going the full retool route. They ended up trading for Andrew Ladd with my New York Islanders, got 2 second-round picks as well as a third. They just threw him on LTIR. One of those second-round picks ended up becoming J.J. Moser. The OEL and Garland trade for the 11th overall pick, which ended up being Dylan Guenther, and a second-round pick was fantastic. They basically just took on a bunch of the Canucks' bad contracts that they didn't really care about. They got a second-round pick just to take on Shane Gothisbehere. Shane Gothisbehere was a solid defenseman for them for 2 seasons, and then they flipped him for a third round. Got a first-round pick for Darcy Kemper when they really didn't need him anymore. A second and a third round for Zach Kassian, like I mentioned before. A first and a second-round pick for Christian Dvorak. That was fantastic. They traded up for Connor Geekie, which I didn't really like at the time, but Connor Geekie is looking like a very good prospect, tearing it up in the WHL. And you look at his drafting record, Dylan Guenther, J.J. Moser, Sam Lipkin in 2021, 2022, Cooley, Geekie, Julian Lutz, and Maverick Lamoureux, and then Artem Duda as well as that in 2022. And then in 2023, Shimashev, Boot, Herbala. Look at the Coyotes when he took over. Their prospect pool wasn't really anything. Now it is one of the best in the entire NHL. And their previous best prospects were like Barrett Hayden, who hasn't really panned out. Why am I doing number? Next up, this is the 5th to last guy, but Kevin Cheveldayoff inherited an absolute shit Thrashers franchise. He was the first general manager of the Winnipeg Jets back in 2011. They made the playoffs only one time in his first 5 years, and that wasn't really his fault. The team that he inherited was just that bad, but in the last 6 years, they've made the playoffs 5 times. He built basically the entire core, drafted Mark Scheifele in 2011, I believe, obviously drafted Ehlers, Morrissey, Connor, Perfetti, like basically everybody on the goddamn team. And even in a small market like Winnipeg, he's gotten guys like Scheifele, like Hellebuck, and even Kyle Connor signed an extension as an RFA to stay in Winnipeg. And even the guys that have wanted to leave Winnipeg and wanted out, Jacob Trouba, they ended up getting Neil Pionk in a first-round pick. So I like he's been able to get value for the guys that wanted to leave. PLD as well. He just straight up won that PLD deal. Probably won the Jacob Trouba one if they had to pay $8 million. So he's done such a good job building in Winnipeg, considering Winnipeg is probably the most unattractive market on average for NHL players to play in. He's fostered a culture of a pretty solid culture of guys that want to stay. He's hired pretty good coaches throughout his tenure. Paul Maurice, Rick Bowness. It's been pretty consistent. So in looking at Winnipeg, I would give Kevin Cheveldayoff an A for his grade. Even though they haven't made a Stanley Cup final, they've only made one Western final. Considering how good they are, he's been there for 12, 13 years. They've really built a consistent base and a solid roster that he's built the entire thing. Some of these other guys, they've inherited good rosters, like Patrick Alvine doing a fantastic job. He inherited basically the entire roster. Like it wasn't like he drafted Pettersson, not like he drafted Hughes. Cheveldayoff has built all of it in Winnipeg, and as a result, the past 2 to 3 years, basically since like they made that Western Conference Finals, they have been one of the better teams in the NHL. 4th to last, Rob Blake. Rob Blake, I'm going to go with a B. He inherited the team at a really weird time where they missed the playoffs for the first time in a while back in 2017. They were not very good, but he did a solid job doing this retool. The problem was obviously a guy like Turcotte didn't pan out. Byfield looks like he's panning out now. I do like Brandt Clark, but some of their young guys really didn't pan out in terms of their draft picks from 2017 up until like 2021. And when you look at what he did, he obviously sold in that little rebuild period. Second round pick for Toffoli, first round pick for Dursey, 2 seconds for Martinez. Those were all solid deals, as well as when he started to go and out and win. Now got Arvidsson for a second and third round pick, which is a solid deal. The Fiala for Faber and Ogren deal, I really liked it at the time. Obviously, Faber has developed into a pretty much a stud, not as good as Fiala as of right now, but still. Korpisalo and Gavrikov at the deadline last year was pretty solid. It's really just this year he kind of fumbled the bag. There was obviously the Cal Peterson, Ivan Provorov, Sean Walker. He sent Peterson and Walker over to Philly, and then they ended up giving up a second-round pick as well. Got that off the books, but Sean Walker has been playing so good this year, so that kind of sucks for LA. They ended up giving Gavrikov 5.8, who has been very good in his own right. So that was the first deal where I was like, it hasn't really panned out that great for LA. Then they end up trading a second-round pick for Sean Dursey, which, yes, they did have Jordan Spence and Brant Clark in the system, but Sean Dursey has turned into like not a legit number one defenseman, but at least a legit top pairing guy. He's the number one kind of by default in Arizona. And then lastly, the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade has kind of been a disaster for him. So before this season, I thought he was doing a pretty solid job. I would have given him an A- or B+, but the team has kind of fallen apart of late. I mean, obviously, maybe there's some recency bias in this, but it's not like they've won playoff series with Rob Blake as the general manager. And what you do most recently is going to affect your core the most recently. So when looking at locking up a PLD for 8 years at $8.5 million, as well as the fact Dursey's just going to continue to be a stud, I'm a little bit concerned with the LA Kings, and Rob Blake did make some mistakes this offseason. Still a B, still a solid tenure on the whole, but it definitely could have been handled better, especially of late. Bill Guerin. Tough circumstances that he inherited as well. Parisi and Suter contracts were absolutely massive. Drafts Matthew Boldy in 2019, Marco Rossi in 2020, Wallstead in 2021, Ogren in 2022, as well as Yurov. So his draft record is really impeccable. Faber for Fiala was a very, very good deal for the Minnesota Wild, considering they didn't really need forwards. They kind of just needed that lockdown future defenseman. That's what Faber has turned into. And he's also been awesome on extending his players. You look at Joel Eriksson Ek back in 2021. He signed him on an 8-year, $5.25 million contract. Kirill Kaprizov got locked up for 5 years and $9 million, which he hasn't been playing that good, but he's still easily worth $9 million. And that was during the whole Russia stuff, like when they had to smuggle him in. Boldy's locked up for 7 years, $7 million, and Brodin's only making $6 million, and Zuccarello's still playing at an extremely high rate, and he just locked in another extension for Zuccarello, 2 years, $4.125 million. So he has really had to deal with tough circumstances. I know they're not that good this year, but it's just a miracle that the previous years that they were so good, considering they had 12 or 13 or $14 million in dead cap with those contracts. I have the utmost faith that once those deals are up in a year or two, those buyouts are up, they're going to be fantastic under him. Kelly McCrimmon, A. Obviously, he has won a Stanley Cup. That kind of goes into this. He is one of the few active general managers that have won a Stanley Cup. His thing was he was just so goddamn aggressive with this team. He obviously went out and bought pretty heavy, ended up signing up Pietrangelo, trading 2 seconds for Martinez. He traded Marc-Andre Fleury after he won the goddamn Vezina. People thought that he was crazy. Marc-Andre Fleury immediately fell off. The Vegas Golden Knights were perfectly fine. Pulled the trigger on the Jack Eichel deal, which, yes, Alex Tuch did end up becoming a very good player, but Peyton Krebs ended up busting. And although they did get Osterland with their first-round pick, he wasn't going to be on the Vegas Golden Knights team last year when they won the goddamn Stanley Cup. So that is a win deal for them. And especially when you look at what all the other deals that led to that Stanley Cup, they traded a 4th-round pick for the San Jose Sharks for Adin Hill, as well as the Barbashev for Zach Dean deal was an absolute steal when you look at Zach Dean has 4 points in the AHL this year in 34 games, as well as even this past recent summer, ended up trading Riley Smith for a 3rd-round pick, which people thought was an absolute steal for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Riley Smith started out very good, but now has 9 points in his last 31 games. And then lastly, we got Doug Armstrong of the St. Louis Blues, and he's been the longest tenured general manager in the entire Western Conference since 2010. And even though he didn't draft his 2 cornerstone pieces for most of that being Tarasenko, who was drafted a couple weeks before that, and Pietrangelo in 2008, they were just such a consistent bunch around him for basically the entire 2010s. They missed the playoffs his first season as general manager. Then they went on to make it 10 out of the next 11 seasons. Drafted very good, especially in the mid 2010s, that helped lead to the Stanley Cup and helped lead to a lot of pieces today. They drafted Fabry, Barbashev, Wallman, Husso, Sammy Blais just in 2014, 2015, Vince Dunn, but that also was a negative because he left Vince Dunn protected in the expansion draft. 2016, Tage Thompson and Jordan Kyrou. Obviously, we'll get into it. Tage Thompson led to the Ryan O'Reilly deal in 2018 that obviously propelled them to a Stanley Cup. 2017, Robert Thomas. Early on, they also did deals like trading Shattenkirk for Eric Johnson, then went on to trade Shattenkirk for a first and second round pick in 2017 when they missed the playoffs, got a first and a second for that they were able to later able to use. So obviously that 2019 Stanley Cup run, the number one move, the biggest move of the previous offseason was the Ryan O'Reilly deal. So Armstrong had his fingerprints all over that. And even they did fall off eventually, but that was after an 11-year fantastic run, and he was able to recognize that and thankfully trade Tarasenko and Ryan O'Reilly and get 2 first-round picks, a third, and a fourth. Yes, it did get ugly towards the end, considering he did sign some bad deals like Torrey Krug and Colton Parayko, as well as Jordan Binghamton. It's still a great tenure, considering he's been there for almost 14 years now. Win a Stanley Cup, I think you got to get an A. I didn't give out any A pluses on this, because I don't really think there is a perfect general manager. We'll see in the next version if there is an A plus. But let me know in the comments, what do you think about this? This was a very long video, and I'll be seeing you in the next one.